So, thank you for this very nice presentation, very interesting, on a very important topic. The presentation was full of details, arguments, so I am sure we will have a lot of questions and the debate will be very interesting. So I have the task of introducing this discussion, the debate, which will follow. And to do the, can I have the, to change the slides?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So I will be very brief because I'm sure that the discussion will be very interesting later. I would like just to make 3 points to introduce the discussion, and points which are adding some ingredients and building upon what Professor Krueger said, and will focus especially on Italy and European policies. So my first point will be on youth unemployment, the second on European policies, and the last one on female employment. So first of all, as Professor Krueger underlined during this very important lecture, we know that youth unemployment is the main characteristic of the phenomenon of the long-term unemployment, in particular in Europe. So here you see unemployment rate variation in Europe for the period 2007-2012 by age group. And you see very clearly that the young group, so the group between 15 to 24 years old, is the more affected by a high variation in this unemployment rate. So we also understood and learned that youth unemployment is particularly costly. And this is because it relates to future unemployment. It has a negative impact on income levels, and it also affects the well-being of individuals, their health status, and their job satisfaction. So another important piece of information that we learned today is that the recession may be important and may matter in this process, but the problem is somehow more structural. So it's not only a problem of bad conditions in this time, but it's a more structural problem. And this is especially true also for our country, for Italy. So here we have to debate, and we can discuss a little bit more, why is unemployment concentrated among young people? Probably there are main driving mechanisms behind this, which is not only the bad conditions of the economy at this time, but also the institutions. Professor Krueger said, your institutions matter. And also probably our school-to-work transition for young workers, and many other characteristics of our labor market, which are very important to understand why is unemployment concentrated among young people. Probably also the social protection system, or somehow some more cultural issues, such as the relation with family ties. This is also playing a role in this phenomenon. My second point is European policies. We know that the European Commission has introduced a youth-targeted action because of the serious problem of long-term unemployment concentrated of young individuals. And this is called the European Youth Guarantee, according to which member states have to ensure a good quality offer to young people, offer in terms of employment or continued education or traineeship within a very short period. So this action, which started in this period, in these days, this action is meant to reduce the persistence of unemployment, because we know that early intervention are very important. So early intervention are very important in terms of reducing the bad consequences of long-term unemployment. So in this direction, this is a very important action. But we also learned that Europe is different from the US. And not only Italy is different from the US, but Europe is different also within Europe. So there are differences across European countries, which are very remarkable in terms of labor market institutions, demographic characteristics, and many other type of economic and social issues. So here we have, of course, The action at the European level is very important to enforce member states to take some action and to provide some measures which may be very important to reduce long-term unemployment. But of course there is no magic recipe, and therefore this unique policy for all European countries have to be debated. And especially we have to verify the effectiveness of this type of policies, because of course these are important actions, but we cannot avoid structural reforms. If, we said before, the problem is not only related to the bad conditions in time of recessions, but on more structural characteristics of the labor market, including labor tax reforms, institutional reforms, the wage setting, and many other things that characterize our labor market, we have to think about the possibility and the opportunity of still introducing structural reforms, and not only this type of action. Another important issue is somehow related to the labor supply, labor demand. We discussed this a little bit before, because of course this type of measures are going to activate the search on the labor market, but on the other side we have to incentivize also the demand, especially for youth employment by firms and companies. And finally, there is an important point, again at the European level, which is the importance of mobility. We know that in Europe we have to guarantee free circulation of workers, and this can be very important to give free access to all young individuals in all countries to this type of measures, because this may also have long-term consequences and try to reduce the long-term consequences of long-term unemployment. My final point is related to female employment. This is something that is much more related to what I study, and I do research on that. And this is very important point, for, I think, especially for our country. We know that in Italy we have a female employment rate of only 47%, which means that only 1 out of 2 women work actually in our country. The average in Europe is around 58%, and in the US 62%. So female employment is also a very important phenomenon when we talk about unemployment, something which is not fully captured by the statistics of unemployment, because many of these women are not even looking for a job, but it is also long-term and costly. Costly because for women, because it's long-term, because when you are out of the labor force, it's very difficult to get in, and this transition is even more difficult for women. It's costly for the families because it reduces the quality of life, and also for the whole country, because if we leave out of the labor force 50% of women in a country, and this happened in Italy, it means that we are losing some resources for our economic system, especially if you think that there are no gender gaps in education, in productivity, and therefore these women are also educated as men. So again, in terms of European policies, we know that Europe is aware of this, and actually in 2000, the Lisbon Agenda set a target for 2010, which was a recommendation to the member states to reach 60% of female employment rate by 2010. Of course, Italy was not able to reach this target. I mean, other countries did it. And now there is a new target for 2020, which is 75% for both women and men. So it's even a more ambitious target. So my question here, and for the debate, is also whether we also need a women-targeted action. Professor Krueger said we need targeted action, and we need somehow to experiment a little bit around the different types of long-term unemployment and long-term unemployees. And therefore, maybe we also need a women-targeted action, and we have to discuss and think a little bit more carefully at policies which may work in terms of promoting female occupation. Thank you. So now we can take questions from the audience. We have a lot of students, so I'm sure there will be several questions. Yes, it's there. Okay.
You spoke about the benefits in the USA. The problem is with Europe that maybe we have too much social protection because unemployed people may find a little interest in getting back their jobs since the benefits they receive from the government may be too little. The difference may be too little with the wage they would receive if they took back the job.
We take another question.
The situation you sketched is quite different as we saw, for Italy with the long-term unemployment more stronger among young people. So I think that most of the solutions that have been put forward are about educational system reform and so on. But I was wondering whether there is a short-term solution to long-term unemployment for the youth. And I also had another question, which is more about monetary policy. So how do you think that the different pressure that long-term unemployed have on inflation rates and wage growth could pose to an accommodating monetary policy like now, and even more now that we have sort of forward guidance targets in terms of unemployment? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Professor Allen. I have remembered that you mentioned the problem of moving U.S. companies or sourcing companies back from China to U.S. And I'm wondering, does it work or just a simply political slogan? I'm just caring about this one. Okay, thank you.
Maybe you can start replying.
Sure. Those are all very good questions. When I talked about unemployment benefits for the U.S., I really had the U.S. context in mind.
Should be activated better.
So in the U.S., unemployment benefits normally last half a year, and the benefit amount is typically half or less of what the person was making previously. It's not a very generous system. It's a lifeline, but it's not the case, I think, that most workers who are unemployed would prefer to stay on benefits than to be employed. There may be some exceptions to that, but certainly at a time when demand is weak, the benefit system is having relatively little effect on overall job growth because there are many people who don't qualify for benefits who fill the job openings if there is some disincentive effect from benefits. I think Europe is very different, and I think different parts of Europe are very different. I think it makes sense to have a system where benefit generosity declines the longer people are unemployed, to give more of an incentive to look for a job. I think one of the strengths of the U.S. system has been that 26 weeks of benefits seem like a good balance. When most of the unemployed were unemployed for less than 26 weeks, it made a lot of sense. And I think having extensions at certain periods made some sense. I think that the point that you raise is a good one, that it's certainly conceivable, plausible, that in many other countries the benefit system may discourage work and could lead to the types of structural problems that Paulo was talking about. So I was describing the benefit system in the context of the U.S. Monetary policy. This is currently a heated debate among central bankers, and I don't think there is a consensus. Janet Yellen has expressed her view that she's skeptical that the long-term unemployed exert little pressure on the economy. or that a stronger economy wouldn't help them. She's also pointed to the fact that a relatively high number of workers are working part-time, and they say they would like full-time jobs, and that's additional slack on the economy. So that's one view from a very important central banker. She also said that she'll adjust if the facts change. Mark Carney, and if you look at the inflation report from the UK, Bank of England, is more persuaded by the argument that short-term unemployment matters more for inflation. I think the evidence for Europe points more in that direction, but even in Ricardo Laudis's research, not every country had a smaller impact for the long-term unemployed. I think it does mean that there's less space for accommodative policy, if this is correct. On the other hand, in the US and in Europe, inflation has been below the 2% target for so long that I would make a mistake on the side of waiting too long, frankly, rather than acting to head off fear of rising inflation. And I've said this before, I said this on television last week. I think that inflation targeting makes a lot of sense. I would wait for more robust signs that inflation is rising. And I think the central bank in the US may have made a mistake by being so precise in their inflation target. I think having a range, 2 to 4%, would have made more sense. It's very hard to hit exactly a 2% figure. I don't think that there is unanimity in the Board of Governors or the Federal Reserve System as a whole on this issue. If you look at the research that's coming out of places like the Atlanta Fed, I think it suggests that the short-term unemployed matter much more for wage growth than the long-term unemployed. So I think this is an area where there'll continue to be debate. And as I emphasized in my remarks, there are factors in addition to the labor market that affect inflation. Healthcare costs have been growing much more slowly in the US than they have historically. In fact, with healthcare reform, healthcare costs grew at their lowest rate in 50 years last year. I said to the president once, can you imagine how they'd criticize you if costs were growing at their highest rate instead of the lowest rate? This is what it's like to be president. You actually get good results and you get criticized for healthcare reform. Anyhow, that has been slowing inflation. So I think we could tolerate a little bit of inflation. I think that inflation's been so far below the target for a while, it's not the end of the world if there are stronger signs before the central bank acts. That's my own personal view. Then the last question about manufacturing, I think we are having some success in the US. In this recovery, we've added 500,000 manufacturing jobs in the US. In the last recovery, we lost 4 million manufacturing jobs. I mean, it's kind of an amazing contrast. I think, however, we are swimming uphill. I think that worldwide, manufacturing employment is shrinking because productivity growth has been so strong. So, in some sense, we're fighting for a declining share of overall employment, for a declining number of jobs. It's a positive thing, ultimately, that productivity growth has been so strong. It's what enables living standards to rise. But it does mean that we need to create new sectors, opportunities in other areas for people to find employment, which is one of the reasons why I think the strategy of focusing on innovation, creating new iPods and iPads and new uses for them, could lead to more employment. And I also think if you look at the history of innovation, it's often young people. So one area I'd also recommend for Italy is to think about how can you encourage entrepreneurship and how can you provide funds for young people to start up small businesses, invest, and some of them will succeed. That's something that we've been trying to strengthen in the United States.
Good evening, Professor Krueger. My name is Boudewijn Wijnands and I'm from the Netherlands. What I find shocking in your presentation that apparently in Italy that the group of the most or least likely to be represented in the long-term unemployment are the oldest work group of 50 plus. First of all, I would imagine that to be different in the Northern European countries. Maybe your thoughts on that. And secondly, that result, is that not due to the rigid labor market in Italy, very strong regulations against firing older people, and should that not change in order to, for the labor market to be more flexible and that the youth unemployment could go down? Thank you.
That's an excellent point. I don't know the answer whether it's very different in Northern Europe. I would have expected it was similar. So that's something that one could look at. I don't know the answer. Since you're from the Netherlands, I will add one other response. Actually, you probably wanted to gather some questions. But this also is a little bit in response to Paula's excellent comments. The Netherlands has done very well in terms of job growth, I think mainly because of flexibility for women. And the US, which had 62% by your number of the women are employed, most of them are in full-time jobs. Many of them would like more flexible opportunities. So the US has declined in terms of female employment. And Northern Europe, and Netherlands is a very good example, has seen an increase, mostly because of more flexible and part-time jobs. In the US, we still lead most of the world in terms of full-time employment of women. We don't provide many opportunities for more flexible employment. And this is one area where I have to say, in my job, I mostly focused on policy. In fact, I was told, only focus on what's good policy, let other people handle the politics. But I did observe that this is an area where I think good policy is also good politics. It's very popular to talk about providing a friendlier work environment for women, time off from maternity leave, and also for their husbands to support them at that time. We haven't done a very good job in the US reducing overall work hours as productivity has increased. Part of that, I think, is related to our healthcare system, where if you're an employer and you're paying for healthcare, you'd rather somebody work a long work week rather than hire an additional worker and have to pay for that worker's healthcare as well. That may change with the Affordable Care Act to some extent. Anyhow, I was struck by the youth results, but I partly expected them because I tend to think of Europe as a whole, not only Italy, as being much more of an insider-outsider type economy, where the insiders have more control, and it's harder for the outsiders to gain employment. One way around that is to allow more temporary contracts and have them last longer and so on. In the US, we have a system called employment at will. Employment at will says that the default is it's a temporary contract. Employment at will says unless there's a specific contract that says that this is a job that will last indefinitely or for a certain period of time or someone won't get fired for the following reasons, an employer can fire someone for any reason which is not protected by law. They can't fire someone because of race, but they can fire someone because they don't like them. They could fire someone because they think the person is too short or too tall. Arbitrary reasons like that. And that type of a system has both benefits and costs. It means that we're more volatile. Unemployment rose very quickly in the US in the recession because it was very easy for employers to reduce employment. I think you saw the same thing in Spain and Italy where workers who were on short-term contracts, it was very easy to eliminate them. So it does mean that the economy is subject to more shocks. I think the US system has worked well. I would think about ways of reducing the power of the insiders. But at the same time, there are also benefits from having that kind of protection. So I think that needs to be addressed very carefully.
Good evening. Hi. Despite the lower rates in terms of unemployment in the USA, in the data you analyzed today, I've seen all over the web an increasing concern about student loans and the fact that there's a huge unemployment in the young rate. What are your opinion about that? And what is your opinion about that? And especially, what do you think are the policies that can prevent that unemployment of becoming of long term? Thank you.
I have a question about female unemployment. And how much do you think that female unemployment, especially in the Mediterranean area, is still due to a cultural bias? I mean, if I work, I know that the society will criticize me. I'm referring especially to Italy. And how much instead is due to the fact that females still lack of infrastructure that help them to work while they are mothers?
So student loans is a very important issue in the U.S. I have mixed feelings, I have to confess, because one of the problems in education is that people don't have access to credit. And we think of education as an investment. If you're going to make an investment, it makes sense to borrow. Then you pay back what you borrowed. And that makes the world work better, and it provides more access to college. So I think that having access to student loans is very important and ultimately is in the interest of the country and of individuals. At the same time, we've seen a very rapid growth in student loans. That's partly driven because it's easier for people to get student loans than other kinds of loans, partly because of the government involvement in student loans. So a lot of families where they might have wanted to charge up their credit card or take out a second mortgage, they couldn't do that, but they could tell their kids, get a loan to go to college, and that will save them money. So some of what's been going on in the US is the credit markets have still been tight, in spite of all of the efforts that we made to support the financial institutions. The credit markets continue to be tight. Families are looking for ways to borrow, and they're using student loans to a greater extent. In the short run, that's actually helped the economy. So I think that the recovery would be weaker if we didn't see this buildup in student loans. In the long run, and I should also say, it also means that more people are getting higher education. In the long run, that's good that we have more college enrollment. There are lots of problems with our colleges. There are lots of problems with students not graduating, majoring in fields that are not necessarily in demand. But it's good that our college enrollment has increased. The problem for the economy in the long run is that a generation of students has greater debt, which makes it harder for them later on to get the down payment to buy a house, and also makes it harder for them to buy a car. And we're seeing a trend where young people are buying fewer cars in the US. It's kind of amazing that the auto sales have done so well, given that young people are buying fewer cars in the US. And it's developed interesting new areas where people share cars. You know, you probably have Zipcar here.
Oh, we do have a lot.
And I think it's related to this phenomenon that young people are buying fewer cars. So I think the problem with student loan debt is twofold. One is, I think college costs have been growing too quickly. And I think at the most prestigious schools, a lot of the growth in cost is not productive academically. Building student centers and putting on activities for students which are really not educationally related. And we've had a little bit of an arms race where because Yale built a student center, Princeton built one. Students were doing just fine at both schools beforehand. Also, I mentioned to Tito yesterday, the highest paid employee in most state governments is the coach of the football team or the basketball team at the state school. Now, I love watching the sports, but I think we've gone overboard. And controlling costs, I think, makes sense, and I think we need to figure out how to use technology better in education. I think that will happen. I would try to expedite that. So how do you get the colleges to control the rate of growth and costs? number one. And number two, are there ways of being more flexible with student loans to allow more time before students start repaying their loans, to allow them to refinance if interest rates should fall? Or we also have developed a new program where take-up has not been as high as I would have liked, where students can go into a field like education, something which is socially valuable, and pay off their student loan by paying a share of their income as opposed to a fixed payment each month. So if they pay a certain percentage of their income, then they will pay off their student loan in that way. They do it for a certain number of years. And I think that would be helpful because it could encourage people to go into socially useful activities like healthcare or working at a nonprofit, working in education, which doesn't pay as much as Wall Street, but is socially more productive in my view. You also asked about preventing long-term unemployment. I think the clearest way is having a stronger economy. And short of that, I think we really need to search more for solutions. The question about female unemployment and culture is very interesting. And I have to say, I've been struck because I think I received about as many, if not more, questions from female students than male students, which is quite different than the US. And I've often given lectures where I've gone to places and I say, I'm not going to leave until one of the female students asks a question. So I'm learning something about Italian culture. I think that what you see in the US and many other countries, there's been very good research on this in Sweden, where female employment is very high and they seem to have a lot of opportunities, there is nonetheless a glass ceiling. And how do we go to the next level? How do we make it easier for women to break through the glass ceiling? Because women seem to have made tremendous advances in certain professions. We saw, actually I once did something for Hillary Clinton on this when I worked in the Clinton administration. I got a request from her about what fraction of law students were women when she first started law school and today. And the change is dramatic. It went from a very, very small fraction to over half. If you look at medicine, if you look at dentistry, we've had tremendous progress. Where we haven't had as much progress is at the next level, becoming the CEO, becoming part of the executive suite. And part of that, I think, is related to the tremendous demands, time demands, lack of flexibility for those jobs. But there are also probably ways to redesign the jobs so that they're more flexible. And that has happened in some fields. My friends Larry Katz and Claudia Golden have done work on pharmacies and the way that they have made work more flexible and have seen a tremendous increase in the number of female pharmacists, which has been good for business, for the pharmacies, and also, I think, good for society. And you called it infrastructure, but I think we need to think more about the way work is organized and how we can organize work in a way that is more hospitable to women. And I think it's the case in Italy and the US as well. Given demographics, given slower population growth, we're going to need to utilize all of our resources and to take full advantage of all of the talent we have. And I tried very much when I was working for the president to make this a prominent issue. We did, in the economic report of the president, have a section on why the U.S. is falling behind other countries. We had an analysis, and I think we had Netherlands as one of the countries we compared the U.S. to. And also, what are the kinds of policies that could lead to more flexibility in the workforce, which I believe would be good for business, good for the economy, and also good for society.
Well, I think on this very important note, I think I'm sure we would have many other questions to be asked, and as you've seen, Professor Krueger would answer with a very thorough analysis on many different subjects, but unfortunately the time is almost ended for this lecture. So I would like to thank once more Alan Krueger for this very thorough lecture and very nice presentation. Also, also for the fact that he spent a lot of time in translating, what in a completely different institutional setting as the one of Italy, some of his findings and looking at the condition of Italian labor market. So we are really very pleased by his lecture, and we will have to study it and even more in the next few days. So I also would like, before closing this lecture, to thank the person without whom this lecture would have not been possible, Marcella Boroli, Vice President of the Fondazione Boroli, Giuseppe Alemani, President of the Fondazione Boroli, Silvia Cadari and Luciana Dacol, who work in the foundation, and also, let me say, also Brunella Santi and Alessandra Gerosa, who have been very important on the Bocconi side in the organization of this event. Thank you so much to all of you.